Today you're going to hear from Brandon Williams, who's a 17-year veteran from the United States Air Force, where he was a F-15E Fighter Pilot. He takes the concepts that he learned in the military and applies them to business. He's been doing it for 8 years as a keynote speaker and an executive consultant. His program on human factors leadership is wonderful. Today we're going to learn about how to mitigate human error, what is a commander's intent, his perspective on decentralized execution, a debrief, developing informal leaders, and who should be creating tactical plans. If you like what you're hearing, please help us spread the word to more entrepreneurs by rating us the number of stars that we deserve on Apple Podcasts. You're going to love what you hear from Brandon Williams. Hey, Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rich and John. Appreciate you having me, and always great to sit down and talk with people like you, especially entrepreneurial type subjects and topics, given I consider myself a bit of a serial entrepreneur. So thank you.
Serial entrepreneur and grew up in your background's in the military. Tell us about your experience in the military even before and how that blossomed into something entrepreneurial for you.
Yeah, obviously my military background and what I did in the military directly influenced a lot of things I did post-military. So starting way back when, I come from the Atlanta, Georgia area. I actually live here now, but I was born and raised here. Went to the United States Airforce Academy, graduated from there, and went on to Air Force pilot training, where I went on to fly the F-15E Strike Eagle in the Air Force. I served 12 years almost active duty, where I, in addition to being a fighter pilot, served in several leadership roles in the military as well, and a lot of other training that influenced what I did post-military. That also led to a career where I got on with a major airline, which was perfect for starting my own business and doing the entrepreneur thing, because it gives me a lot of the flexibility just based on the schedule and how I can, work my schedule to do things like that. So major airline pilot. And then I got into the management leadership consulting world about 8 years ago. A couple of years ago, I started my company, LeadTac, which I got the idea for it because as I was working with all these Fortune 500 companies and business leaders all over the world, we would give them these processes and models. But what I saw were questions I were getting were, kind of what I consider basic leadership questions. So topics about accountability, communication, empowerment, motivation, all these different topics that I saw were very individualized with leaders, if you will. And that's where I got the idea for LeadTac. And it stands for Leading Tactically, LeadTac, because the whole idea is when you talk about leadership, strategy is important, and we have to have strategy, obviously. But when you talk about leadership, you're talking about connecting that strategy to execution and leading your people through that, which leadership really gets, when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, really gets to the tactical wiring of how we work and operate as humans, and what motivates us, what drives us, all those different topics we can talk about. And so that's where I get the term LeadTac, and it really is focused on the whole model is what I base everything on, is what I call a human factors leadership model, which essentially, again, taps back into my experience going back to my days as a fighter pilot. When you jumped on that aircraft and there's 250 switches, dials, and displays, and I was a young 20-something, and you look at this, and you're just looking at this stuff, and you haven't even fired up the airplane yet. And then you turn it on, the engines roar, and all the lights and bells and whistles come up. I mean, you've had the training, you've had the simulators, but when you first get in there, it's like kickoff time. You're there, and you can imagine the complexity and the variables you're facing. And then you take off, and now you're flying at 340 miles per hour with potentially other teammates or wingmen that you're operating with in a very dynamic, complex environment. When you're talking about weather, terrain, and this is just peacetime. We're not even talking about any kind of combat operations. So what I got from that, though, was the way we trained, the way we mitigated human error, the way we worked in those complex environments. That's where I developed the model and take some of those attributes. Because I said, hey, if I could take this stuff that I did, then how they quickly accelerate us to a point where we can operate in that environment and lead in that environment. what that could do for other teams. So that's the whole background where I got the idea for it. Obviously, my military background goes right into that, and it directly, is a basis for what I teach and what I consult with.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that overview. You had started when you had talked about strategy and connecting strategy with execution. Can you elaborate on strategy and vision? Maybe some of the difference between the two, how you would recommend those get developed, and then ultimately how that gets connected to execution.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, when you hear about strategy and vision, kind of a business question always comes up, no matter what world you're in. And I think the best way, strategy is that roadmap to that vision. To put it simply, I think, you can read about leaders that the reason they're such good leaders is because they can translate a vision very well. They may not be the most proficient technical expert or the smartest person in the room, but they're extremely good at defining that vision and defining that end state. One of the components of my human factors leadership model I talked about was I simply call it leadership and a just culture. And what that is, though, really part of that is what we in the military, what we called was commander's intent. And commander's intent is a very detailed, clear view or vision, if you will, of what the end state looks like. If you know anything about D-Day and the history of that, by all accounts, the initial execution of it was going to look like a military failure. I mean, weather rolled in, winds, fog, paratroopers were separated for miles and miles and miles, separated from teams. Some of them landed by themselves. And so if you were looking at that real time from a God's eye view, you would say, oh my gosh, it's going to be a disaster. But what happened? You saw teams come together. You saw individual units, men that have never met each other in their life, obviously on the same side, but they get together, and what do? They start moving forward because they had a very clear commander's intent, a very clear, detailed vision of what the end state was. And then we all know, obviously, what happened after that. So I think it's that being able to be what I call clear, concise, correct, calm, and being able to translate that commander's intent, but more importantly, being able to delegate that through decentralized execution.
Yeah, I apologize I didn't start with this. Thank you for your service.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that.
I appreciate my freedom, and it's because of guys like you. And I think I'd shared with you on a call we had last week or so. I have a 17-year-old that
yeah, you did.
Is getting into the Navy herself, and we're just starting to learn what that's all about as a family. And
right,
appreciate everything it took for you to have sacrifice in doing that.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Obviously from the management consulting, right, prior to starting LeadTac and whatnot, you did a lot of process improvement you talked about. What was the primary thing that you would find most common in those companies that you would go tweak?
Something we did as a fighter pilot in the Air Force, something that was near and dear to our heart was what we called a debrief. And it didn't matter after every mission, combat, peacetime, it didn't matter. We always came back, and whoever was part of that formation, we went in the room, shut the door, and we conducted a debrief. And it was a debrief where, again, it didn't matter what you could be, and this has happened before. You could be a general officer, you could be an admiral, you could be somebody many years ahead of me in rank and seniority. But if I was the young flight lead that day as a 20-something-year-old or whatever, and I was leading, guess what? I'm running that debrief, and it's my job to not only point out my errors and my mistakes, but also point out your errors and your mistakes. And it's your job, and I've seen generals admit they've done things, and we're in that room because we're trying to make the team better, right? And we're trying to have that open, honest communication. It's a very sanctity type environment. And now in the business world, we talk about things like postmortems and after actions and like you're called root cause analysis, and that's all good. But I think the biggest misstep I saw was this idea, and I mean, people wanted to do it. They thought it was great. But if you don't have the type of leaders that can buy into that, if you don't have the type of people that can take, especially people in those leadership roles, that can open up and admit when they made a mistake, or even worse, if you have those leaders that blame teams for their own mistakes, it's like they say, we don't have bad teams, we only have bad leaders, right? Then you're never going to get better. You're never going to get to that point.
Yep.
And that environment that I called that debrief culture, we called it, what I labeled it was a just culture. this culture, this idea that anyone can speak up, anyone can point out the gaps, as I talked about earlier, and anyone can point out our shortcomings without fear of retribution, without this fear of environment if you're going to get black labeled if you do that. But that's a whole culture change. That's a lot goes into that.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing I had to work with organizations on.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about that because,
Sure.
When you're, obviously you were in the military and the Air Force, and I'd done a lot of sports backgrounds type stuff. And, it's a lot easier in a sports environment to have a conversation debrief after a game about how we lost the game. And, a few shots get thrown across the locker room. Maybe there's people that hurt hard feelings, but then you come back the next day in practice and you tap each other back. Hey, we're all a team, right? Or in the Air Force, I can just imagine you guys doing a debrief and it get a little heated at times. People disagree with the perspective, but at the end of the day, it's you guys versus them, and we're all in this together kind of approach. I find that a lot of leaders have difficulty in the corporate culture, and a lot of employees have a difficulty in the corporate culture because it's a little bit different. We're not at war. The employees may not be perceiving them trying to win a championship. They're there for their income, for their family security, and for them to look up at their superior and say, I don't think you did the right thing in this scenario, or even to a peer and create that friction amongst a peer they usually go to lunch with and throw them, quote unquote, under the bus in front of the boss. It's a very delicate situation I find in the corporate environment. How have you helped companies address that issue?
Great question, because that's the $1 million question I always get, right? Is how do we do this? Is a great idea, but how do we get around this human ego idea? How do we get around this idea of, like you said, throwing people under the bus? And so there's a few things I can talk about there. First of all, I kind of disagree with you on the thing we're not at war. I'd argue that in business we are in combat, whether it's with the competition, whether it's the regulatory environment, whether it's you name it, whether it's just the pace that things move. We are, especially when you talk about something like COVID. I mean, holy cow, that's probably one of the biggest translations. We're in combat ops. I mean, we're starting to get a little more steady with it, but the last few months, I mean, a lot of businesses have been in combat ops, I would argue.
I'd love to get Rich's opinion. We'll go to my question in a second, but I want to stop there. As an entrepreneur, I agree. You're trying to save your business. You cannot have any hard feelings. You got to, no question. Quite honestly, I would agree with you. Every company I'm in, I want to win the championship and beat the competition. That doesn't mean that the 20, 50, or 100 employees on my team who are looking at news on COVID, wondering if they're going to get laid off, feel the same way.
Right.
That's my perspective. I don't know, Rich, if you have a different perspective on that. But I think the difference between entrepreneurs and how they're viewing the competition and the fight versus the employees and how they feel comfortable or not comfortable addressing conflict.
Well, I think there's something as skin in the game, right? As an entrepreneur, you own the business. If things don't work well, whether you're in a COVID combat environment or you're in peacetime in your business, if things aren't working well, you're going to take the majority of that pain, not necessarily the employees. And, the employee mentality, the typical employee mentality is I want to do as little as I can and get paid as much as I can for it. Obviously, that doesn't set a great culture. In the military, you certainly weren't in that culture where those people were around. But there are C players that are in businesses. How do we get those C players to rise up in times when it matters most?
Absolutely. And I think to answer your question, Rich, and going back to your original one, John, it kind of goes back again to what I was talking about talking about a debrief, for example. First of all, the connotation, and this is what I hear a lot of times, you're like, well, I don't want to go and throw somebody under the bus. I don't want them to throw me under the bus. Well, that's the first thing. Let's stop there. Time out. This is not an investigation. What's the purpose of an investigation? To find blame.
Find
right?
Who's responsible.
Exactly. We're trying to find blame on who or whose, whatever, was the problem for this. In a debrief, what are we trying to do? We're trying to find lessons learned to make the team better. Okay. That's the first thing is the culture of it, the idea of it, what you do. A few ways to do that. Number one, do we want to just debrief after things that go wrong? Absolutely not. In my 2,500, 3,000, whatever many sorties I did, in the military especially, of those 2,000 or 3,000 sorties I did, how many of those sorties do you think didn't go really according to plan? What do you think the percentage was that did not go according to plan?
Didn't go according to plan. My guess would be, based on what what I'm hearing, maybe 80%. Didn't meet the objective, maybe 10. That would be my
extremely
guess.
low, right? Is the point. Didn't meet the objective. Very, very low. I'd say it's even lower than that. But when we came back, what did we do? Did we say, you know what, guys, we met the objective, we did it. Hey, nice time. Let's go to the bar. Let's do whatever, right? Absolutely not. Like I said, after every sword, we come back and we debrief, and we would talk about, okay, we did this, but let's digest. Let's break this down, because what do you find when things go right? Well, number one, if you hit a home run, you want the rest of the team to hit a home run, right? But you would also find near misses. You find areas where, hey, we did this, but guys, look, we could have done a lot better if we'd have saw this or this, So we miss a lot of that stuff. The point of it is, don't just debrief when it's a negative outcome. Debrief everything that even not everything, but everything that even positive things. Don't just use it as a negative connotation of, oh, well, the sales call went bad. Let's go debrief this. Hey, the sales call went great. Let's go talk about this. Why? What can we pass on to everybody else? That's the first thing.
And Brandon, before you go to the second one, just because I think it's a really good point right here, I don't want to miss. I was just talking a little bit about, if you hit COVID as an example as a business, and all of a sudden you're in wartime, and all of a sudden you're ultra committed, all of a sudden you're having these conversations with your employees, you're too late. If you build this debrief mentality in your company, day in and day out, every time you're going through these exercises, when a conflict happens, you're already used to that process. No one's feelings are getting hurt at that particular moment. They're not afraid of it. So I think the big point to what you're talking about is, if you have a culture of debriefing, and not just debriefing when times get tough, that plays a big factor. I know a lot of companies, when COVID hit, it was too late for them to change their culture.
And from what I'm hearing from Brandon, that debrief culture is about the lenses. We're looking for lessons learned. We're not looking for who to blame. And we're also not looking for what process can we create that's going to overmanage people ultimately. We're just looking for lessons learned. When we win and when we lose a battle, what are the lessons learned? How do we get better next time?
Yep. Sorry. So let's go to number two.
Yeah.
You can comment on that too,
Well,
but I didn't want to interrupt
it's brought up a couple other things too. So 2, 3, whatever. But number one, you have a structure to it. Yep. So how you're actually going to do this. And again, don't be too rigid, but you have to have a way you conduct these. Otherwise, you're just going to go out there and say, you get into this, you can get into this blame train approach. So have a structure.
Can you lay out a structure for our listeners? Like what's
very simply what I use, PEAR, PAIR. And this is actually human factors background where I got this from. And it's basically person, environment, actions, and then resources. So the people involved, experience, training, things like that. What were the actions they took, actual decisions, the environment. So you talk about regulatory environment, economic environment, competitive environment, all these different things, resources I can go more into that, but the point is you have a basic structure when you analyze stuff and you look at it on what actually, so you're not just focusing on just you, Rich, because you messed this up. We're going to look at everything that came, so we don't miss something. So that's the first thing. You got to have a structure. Don't try. I always say this all the time when I first introduce ideas, like, hey, guess what? Don't try to boil the ocean or solve world peace the first time you do a debrief. Don't take a large task you just took all quarter to accomplish and let's go debrief this. No, start small. I always tell this to sales teams all the time. I'm like, hey, after your next sales call, if you had another team member, especially, just go sit down over a cup of coffee or something. Take 15 minutes and just kind of talk about it. Go over it real quick. Using a pair model or whatever you want to use to kind of go over that. It doesn't have to be this. We go in a room and talk for hours over what went right, what went wrong. Just start small and go from there. And then finally, John, the last thing is, again, I go back. We talk about culture a lot. And that's a big word, right? But I go back to leadership. If you don't have leaders, and everybody I think is a leader in some way or shape or form. Informal leaders, I think in some ways are more powerful than formal leaders. But if you don't have leaders, whether that's leaders in C-suite positions, director positions, VP level, or even just small team leaders that can, have that debrief or that just culture mentality of being able to admit when I'm wrong. Because you've worked for leaders, I know both of you probably have, where you had the ones that were, I never make mistakes. And then you had the ones that would own their mistakes. And more importantly, they would open up to it. And what does that do for you? When you see a leader that you work for that can admit their own mistakes and their shortcomings, you, especially as a junior member, man, you're like, wow,
Yep.
okay, I can open up a little bit more. So I think that's probably the biggest issue. But again, it's like
I also
golf.
think
It's like
that's a
anything
leadership
else.
strategy, Brandon. I think it's a leadership strategy,
It is.
actually,
It
to
is.
be vulnerable and tell your team, you know what, here's my accountability in this thing, because that strategy alone works wonders. And I tell you, when you talk about this whole debrief culture, Rich, it makes me think about the way we were, learned, or I guess when we were out of college, and we still do it to this day. I mean, we cannot get done with this podcast, Brandon, before Rich and I have a conversation about what are a couple of things that went well and what are a couple of things we're going to do better next time. We just can't. It's just part of our DNA, and I'm sure it's part of yours as well, where you just debrief everything. And it's actually funny because you get in a routine with people where we're anxious to see who's going to ask the first person the question, right? Because if I ask Rich hit first or he asked me first, it kind of changes things because we know to expect it. And we had a guest on that came on and talked to Greg Moore, in a fantastic conversation about what he does with his athletes. What are you going to build on and what are you going to work on? And having that constant conversation. It's that same approach, is that culture, that just culture, that debrief culture, and having that mentality of continue. I mean, Rich, one of the companies, or that company you work with, one of their core values is continuous improvement. That's part of that process.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm curious, Brandon,
sorry, go ahead.
In your experience in the military, again, coming from a non-military background, did the people who were calling the shots admit when mistakes were made?
Well, the military is like anything else. I mean, we have good leaders and we have bad leaders, I would argue, right? So, and definition of good as bad is all relative, obviously. So I think that, some of the best leadership lessons I think I've learned are sometimes from those leaders that you didn't really respect informally that much. You respect the rank, obviously, but some of those leaders that maybe, like you asked, Rich, didn't necessarily take ownership of some of their shortcomings, or didn't always encourage that environment. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the military has plenty of examples of leadership that's not so great as well. Just like we have some of the people I would follow anywhere, that I work for. So it runs a spectrum, and you got the ones in the middle too. So it's no different. Again, we're all human, whether I'm in the military or not. So it's no different than a lot of organizations in terms of that. Obviously, the military, like you mentioned earlier, does have the rank structure for a very good reason. But I mean, we still have performance reports. We're still promoted. We're still graded on items, and we're still evaluated. I think one way that is a little different from the business world I've seen is that this idea that our commanders in the Air Force, and a lot of the military, especially all the military, I mean, a lot of times commanders, you're not only graded on how well your organization, hits certain metrics or performs, but you're also graded essentially. And when I say graded, informally, obviously, but you're also graded value on how well the people under you do. In other words, are they being promoted? Are they going on to do bigger and better things? That's looked at, because that is the caring, feeding of your troops, the caring, feeding your people is an extremely important aspect. That again, in the business world, I didn't see. Some organizations are better at it than others, but it's just something that's a lot of variables in the business world I see that and there's other reasons for that. I talk about morale, camaraderie, which is a big part of what I talk about at Lead Tac, on how you do that and things like that. But I think, with the bad leaders and the good leaders, that's one of the biggest things I saw as well, was those people that did look out for their people are the people that, and I always say perception is reality, the leaders you have that the perception is you're not really looking out for my best interest. It's like Colin Powell said, a leader's job is to take care of their people as well. And the day your troops stop coming to you with their problems is the day you've lost, because they either think that you don't care or that there's nothing you can do for them. Either way, it's bad and you've lost them. So
you had talked about informal leaders, people who are not in the highest authority leadership titled positions. What do you recommend to people who are aspiring informal leaders? How do they go about influencing when they don't have rank in business?
what I always say is influence where you can, first of all, right? So we were just talking about the debrief. And one of the biggest comments I'll get, well, Brandon, this is great, but I'm not in a real position to mandate this across anywhere in our organization. So how do I do this? And I say, influence where you can. I guarantee you work with people that you can sit down and do a debrief, if you want to. And what happens from there? You start influence where you can, and hopefully people like it and you can work on it and get it going from there. So that's the first thing is influence where you can. The other thing is, it's like anything else. It's relationships, right? It's getting to know people. And this goes back to when I mentioned earlier, camaraderie and morale. And I sum all this up with what I call mutual support. And mutual support is a word you will hear all the time in combat aviation, really any kind of aviation. But it's this idea, this wingman concept, this idea that you never go out alone and unafraid, right? We always go anywhere with mutual support. We always operate with mutual support. Again, it's to mitigate human error, and it's to back us up. So when things do start changing, like we said, things change all the time. We have somebody to rely on, to fall back on. That goes into peer accountability, another huge part of it. But biggest thing there is that mutual support aspect, and being able to provide that, being able to not only know what your role is on a team, but also know what those other team members' roles are in a team. A lot of times we just focus on our role when we're part of a project or a task. And if we really take the time there to learn what everybody else's role, that gives you that ability to jump in and provide that mutual support. And you know what it's like when you see someone that's not out for themselves and they're out to truly help out the team, and you truly think they are or sense that's the perception, that's when you start getting that informal influence. And that's the biggest thing there, I think.
The mutual support, I can totally see that. As an informal leader, you don't have to have rank in order to provide mutual support. So yeah, that's great. I want to switch gears. You had mentioned decentralized execution. I'm sure we have entrepreneurs who are there, their ears are perked up going, boy, I have more people working from home now in the COVID environment than I've ever had. And things certainly are decentralized. How do we get successful decentralized execution in businesses?
Well, it goes back to leadership. The first thing is what? You've got to have that clear commander's intent. You've got to have that clear end state. Otherwise, because I always say decentralized without any kind of alignment, without that commander's intent is what? That's misguided effort. I mean, your people are probably working hard, but if they don't know the direction we're going, if they don't know what that end state looks like, it goes back to that World War II D-Day example. If they didn't have a good commander's intent, we all landed and we're like, what do we do now? You're just in survival mode. I mean, you're just trying to, what are we going to do? Just, so you don't know which direction to go. You got a bunch of people pulling different ways. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I always call decentralized execution, leadership-backed autonomy. And you've got to have, again, going back to just culture, and this is the basis of everything I talk about, but you got to have that just culture, that idea, that environment where you can delegate that autonomy. And it's very tough, really. This is not easy, because at the end of the day, especially if it's your organization, your company, if people make mistakes and bad things happen, guess what? It's coming back to you with bottom line. I mean, that's where it stops. Or if you are in a leadership position and your team doesn't perform well, you're going to be the one held accountable. So it is tough to have that autonomy. But if you have the right people, you give them that clear commander's intent, what the end state looks like, that's how you set up that decentralized execution.
If I'm an entrepreneur, I'm the leader of a business, I heard what Brandon said, commander's intent. I need a clear view of the end state. Is there a method or a formula, or is there a way to gain that type of clarity to then communicate to others?
Sure. What I always say is clear, concise, correct, calm. That's what we used to always say in the military or in the fighter aviation. Clear, so very simple. Simple is always better, right? Concise, get to the point. We're not trying to elaborate this. We're just trying to be very defined on what it is. And then correct. Make sure it's the correct thing. Obviously, I mean, it sounds funny, but make sure. And the best way to test correct, what I always say, are clear, concise, correct. I do this exercise all the time, and I'll start very simple. I'll ask a leader of an organization, say you have a small room or small team, and I'll say, hey, what are you trying to accomplish here? What's your end state? And they'll say something. And then I'll right in front of their team. And they'll say, yeah, we've been talking about this for a while. And I'll go around the room and I'll say, Rich, what's your team trying to do? And then I'll say, John, what's your team trying to do? And I'll go, and guess what I get? 3-4 different answers, right? And the leader's like, well, we're not. I'm like, it's not clear, concise, correct enough. Go back and start doing it. The other thing that goes along with that, it's the old adage, you can never communicate enough. You can never communicate your end state, your commander's intent enough. And this is one of the biggest issues I see, because we as leaders, we as owners, as entrepreneurs, but we have it in our mind, right? We have what we want to do. And we've told people, we've typed it out, we've told them, oh, of course I'm clear, concise, correct. I've told them, but have you really told them enough? So make sure that you're constantly saying it, but also make sure it's very simple and to the point. And then that quick test is the one I always like to do to show if it's actually clear, concise, correct.
Yeah, Brandon, I think that's a really good point to go on right now, which is, I was talking to an entrepreneur the other day, and I was asking him, where are you trying to go with this? What are you trying to accomplish? And it was a very difficult question. The entrepreneur couldn't answer. So therefore, how is he being clear, concise, and correct to his team on what he's trying to accomplish, or that business is trying to accomplish? And I found that a lot of times the reason why leaders struggle with communicating very clearly what that organization is trying to accomplish is they're afraid of putting themselves in a box. They're afraid of saying, our goal as a company is to do this, because if I say that, then I'm kind of committed to it. And then if it doesn't happen, and then if I have to change it, and then, well, what if this happens? And they start getting all caught up in uncertainty. How do commanders put a clear intent out there when there's so many variables that can go off that changes that intent along the way? And should entrepreneurs pick a clear, concise intent with the knowledge of this may change, but very clearly today, this is what I'm going for? Is that okay?
To answer your question, the second question there, absolutely. It's okay to say, okay, this is our intent. This, because again, if you're going in, this is it. It's never going to change, never going to adapt. That's it. I mean, come on. You're setting yourself up to be way too rigid. But the bigger part here is, I think what you're talking about. If you're struggling with, oh, this may change, this may adapt, you're way too in the weeds. You're way too in the weeds. That's not commander's intent. You're setting out objectives for your people now. Step back some. That's your people's jobs to do. That is their jobs to figure out what they need to do. They're more tactical objectives they need to accomplish to relate to your end state. Because your end state, your intent, it may modify, but and go by the way, it doesn't have to be a one sentence or type term. There may be a few different aspects to your overall end state. Still make it clear, concise, correct, but there may be some different metrics or however you're going to measure it, you name it. But absolutely, number one, it can adapt, it can change, and you may have to slightly modify it. Things change, right? But the biggest thing, if you're asking yourself, oh man, we may need to do this, you're too in the weeds. Yeah. I think you're too in the weeds. You need to step back some and say, look, I'm getting too, detailed here. I need to make it bigger picture here.
Perfect. And so ultimately, when I'm thinking about commander's intent as a company, I'm thinking, why are we in business? What are we, very macro level. And you bring up a really, really good point. Bringing your team into, here's the macro intent. Now let's divide up in groups, and you three over here, and you three over here, and you three over here, and you guys come up with ideas on how we can get there. Too many times I think the leader tries to devise not only the grand mission and vision of the company, but exactly tactically what they should be doing, and then hand out the assignments. And there's a much different buy-in you get from everybody, including in the debriefs, by the way, when they tear the plans apart, because it's the plans they came up with. It's easier to pull a plan apart when they came up with it versus if it's the commander that gave you the plan and then the plan didn't work, and go back and say, commander, that was your fault. So it seems to me like more entrepreneurs can really set the macro vision and then build the team and get for more buy-in. Is that the way you guys did it on your end?
110%. And we used to always say, and I'm going to forget it, it's Eisenhower or Patton who said this, I can't remember, but they always said those who are executing plans should be the ones who are making the plans, basically. So, plans, tactical plans shouldn't be handed down. The art of planning actually is a better, is what you get out of the actual art of planning versus the actual plans themselves. Like we said, plans change. But the art of planning by those who are actually going to execute, that's where you wrap your brain around it. That's where you develop the situational awareness of what you're about to go out and do. That's where you understand everybody's team roles so you can give that mutual support. Because plans change. But if we're in there doing the planning part of it, the ones that are going to execute, absolutely.
Yeah.
And to your point about leaders, bringing other people in and trying to do it all on their own, one of the most powerful things, I had to learn this lesson myself over the years. One of the most powerful things, and maybe you've experienced this, once you realize that you're not good at everything, or once you realize that you're not strong in everything, you have strengths and you have weaknesses, but once you realize that and accept it, that's extremely powerful. And it's extremely liberating on what you can do, what the people you lead can do.
Yeah, no doubt. And you obviously you've had a lot of influences from a lot of different perspectives. A lot certainly from your military background. What was the biggest influence that you've had in your career? And tell us a little bit more about that.
Oh gosh, just in general.
Yeah.
I think going back to obviously the biggest influence really was what I just said. I mean, so the environment I was in, right?
Well, sorry, Brian, let me come back.
Yeah.
Who was the biggest influence is really what I intended to ask. Who was your biggest influence, whether it be a former, military ranking officer or civilian, doesn't matter, or even historical, but who has been your biggest influence?
Oh my gosh. I think there was someone who was a leader of mine when I was in the military that I worked directly for. And I won't name any names or anything, but needless to say, what I did in that role was essentially I led numerous teams with them. I was kind of like right under them, basically, kind of that their number two person, with that lack of a better term. And I learned a lot from them, a lot. I mean, a lot of late night conversations, way after hours, talking about different aspects and things like that. But what I really learned from them, two things they kind of taught me. And I never forget when they told me this. They're like, leadership is like, as a leader, you've got all these plates spinning, right? And you're constantly going back and forth and keeping them all. And there's two things that can get you. Number one, if you focus too much on one plate, what happens? The other ones start to fall. Yep. The other part, though, if you do see one start to wobble, you probably have to devote a little more attention to that one. But you still can't forget the other ones, right? And so leadership was about all these spinning plates and being able to not spend too much time in one, but be able to go over. And this can be people, this can be aspect, it can be different, whatever you want to define those plates.
Sure.
And I love that image of leadership, but they're also the one that told me or kind of expressed that to me when I would struggle. Because again, going back to that world, you talk about type A people, and typically the type of people that make it into the fighter pilot world are the uber type A. That's just whatever personality is attracted to that world. And so it's a highly competitive, highly demanding environment of getting about as close to perfection as you can get. And so what he taught me was, look, Brandon, you're not, I know this is how we operate, but when you get out, you're not good at everything. You're not going to be good at everything. You have to find what your strengths are. And when you realize what you're not good at, the ability to reach out to people to help you, more importantly, the ability to influence people to help you, is what's going to get you, allow you to achieve great things. So what they taught me there, doing that and seeing how they led an organization, that was probably the biggest influence I can think of off the top of my head. And that's something that I had to learn when I transitioned out of the military and going into working in the business world and seeing that and understanding that, hey, the rest of the world doesn't operate near perfection like we do, in that world all the time. And that's okay. I mean, there's a lot of things I can teach people about that world, and I think they need to use that we've talked about here. But, both in my personal and my professional life, understanding that hey, people aren't perfect. And, you're going to have to accept sometimes just that 80% solution, if you will, for lack of a better term, both with yourself and with other things. So I think that was the biggest influence for those reasons. on what I've done.
That's powerful. Before we wrap things up, would love to get your, if there's one thing that you want every entrepreneur who's watching or listening to know and do something with, because knowing is for doing. What is it?
Situational awareness. And we didn't talk a lot about that there, but it's another huge part. And what I always say is, we used to talk, any kind of flying you do, you can talk to any pilot and ask them about situational awareness, and it'll be a big topic. You're taught this, no matter what kind of flying you do, you're taught about situational awareness. I talked about a complexity, operating very complex environments, all these different variables that influence. That's what drives human error, right? When we as humans don't like complexity. We like simple, we like habits, but that's just not the world we operate in, unfortunately. And so it's going to produce human error. One of the biggest ways to combat against that is that situational awareness, constantly maintaining what we called high situational awareness, right? So having a good influence of what are all those variables affecting me. Basically don't get complacent. An example of low situational awareness would be someone walking down the street with their ear pods in, checking email or whatever, looking on their phone as they're walking down the street. High situational awareness, you're constantly, you just feel on top of your game. You know what the competition's doing. You have a good idea of and it's not just situational awareness for your business, it's situational awareness for your people. What's their current state? What is going on with those people on your teams? As entrepreneurs, it's huge, right? What is our situational awareness? What is my focus? Because as I said earlier, we're always, whether it's leadership or you're talking about your own business, you've got those plates spinning. And when you start to focus on one for too long, then what happens? You start to lose situational awareness. They start to wobble those other ones. Or maybe you've got too many plates spinning and you really need to figure out what your focus has to be, because, it's like they say, the art of multitasking is a myth, right? We can task switch, but we can't truly focus on multiple things at one time. So I think situational awareness and constantly what I call it healthy paranoia, kind of having that healthy paranoia always in the back of your mind. Because guess what? When you're straight and level, Rich, flying along 30,000 feet, got it on autopilot, clear sky, what could possibly go wrong? That's when something's going to happen. That's when you're going to be at your, if you're not on top of your game, you don't have that healthy paranoia, that's when you're going to lose an engine. That's when something's going to happen to your business. That's when a client's going to call you and say, guess what? I'm pulling the cord. We're not doing this anymore. So I think that having that high situational awareness is probably the best advice, one piece of advice I could give.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your time today. I know our listeners are going to get a ton out of it. I have pages of notes. If people want to experience more of you, do you have a website, or how would people get in touch with you?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely go to my website, leadtac.com. It's lead-tac, LEAD-TAC.com. You can see about what we do there, more about me, more about our team, what we do. My email, bwilliams, BWILLIAMS at lead-tac.com is a great way to get in touch with me, or you can go to the website and, overview what we do. I've talked a lot about my model, but we customize everything to our clients, virtually, live, you name it. We do leadership development, leadership coaching, organizational development, and we also deliver through workshops and keynotes. Basically, we customize everything to whatever you're looking for and what our clients need.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Rich, John, thank you so much for the time.
Stay with us for a few more minutes while Rich and I break down the podcast.
John, doing a debrief and having pair, I've never heard that. I love that. So person, environment, action, resources, and looking at what worked well and what didn't work well, not just what you and I have learned on areas to continue, areas to improve, but looking at that in that breakdown of those four things. Never heard that before. I love it, and I absolutely want to try it with that lens of lessons learned instead of looking for, okay, what went wrong? It's lessons learned.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go through a little bit, I was looking through my notes here of the conversation, and I love the way, it didn't necessarily flow this way in the conversation, but through the conversation we kind of got there, was everything starts with commander's intent.
Yes.
It starts with what's your company's vision or mission at a very macro level, or what's the entrepreneur's dreams and aspirations and direction. But there's another key point that we talked about, which was those who execute the plan should be creating the plan. That is seldom the case.
Agreed.
In the companies that I've worked with, or now maybe at a micro level they create the plan, but at a macro level they're not engaged in the plan. And I know we learned earlier on about how powerful input is. When people have input into the plan, then they go execute the plan. It brings you to now step 3 that we talked about, that you just talked about, was the debrief. You're more apt to debrief when you actually created the plan to begin with, and more open to feedback if it was a plan that you created with a team, to now look around the table and say, we created this plan. This plan didn't work according to plan, because nothing ever goes according to plan, right? So now we got the debrief culture that fits right in underneath that. And then you have the situational awareness, the emotional intelligence, and the healthy paranoia mixed in there amongst the team members, right? Who are looking over their shoulders, making sure they got each other's back. They got the wingman there. They know that their team members are part of the plan.
Mutual support.
Mutual support. They got the healthy paranoia that maybe halfway through the plan, this isn't working. What do we need to do? Like, let's be paranoid about what we're doing here. And then just that situational awareness to know when to modify and adjust the plan. So I really liked, in recap, commander's intent, people executing the plan, create the plan. Nothing's ever going to go according to plan. So make sure you have a debrief culture. And within all of that, situational awareness and healthy paranoia, I think that really is a good framework for companies to consider.
And Brandon really put a bullet point on it of tactical plans should not be handed down. Period. Tactical plans should be created by people who execute the tactical plans. And the commander's intent was all about just setting the vision of where are we going? What's the end state? How we get there, I'm not sure I care so much. I want it to be effective. I want it to be good. I don't want people to turn over. We want to make profit, but here's where we want to go. And that's the job of the leaders: establish that commander's intent, gather the people so that they can create the tactical plans on how to get there. And the leader then can overlay their experience, wisdom, knowledge, influence on the plans that the people executing them create.
Yeah, but Rich, I guess one thing I'd like to dive into is there's a reason why entrepreneurs, business leaders, managers create tactical plans and hand them down for their team members to execute.
Why do you think? I have a thought.
Come on, don't beat me to it. I was asking you the question.
Okay.
Why do you think that's the case? I'll give you my opinion afterwards, but why do business leaders and managers and entrepreneurs do that? Why do they create tactical plans and hand it down when maybe it's better for the people to come up with the tactical plans?
Yeah, in my experience with our franchise owners, many of them start as single owner operators or fairly smaller businesses. And I experience this with entrepreneurs outside of our franchise system as well. And they end up having to do the tactical execution. So they do create the tactical plans, and they develop efficiencies in the tactical plans that they are executing. So then when they get good at that and they then bring more people on in their business, those tactical plans, it really worked for them. They're trying to help their people. They're not trying to come down on them or overlord on them, right? They're trying to help their people by saying, hey, here's a tactical plan on how to be able to execute that. This works. Do it this way. And in the process of trying to be helpful and pass that along, they're actually stamping out all the enthusiasm that their people could have if they created their own tactical plans. How we did it when we were executing doesn't mean that's how our people do it when they're executing.
Yeah. And I think there's a differentiation there too between what a tactical plan is and a process.
Tell me about
Like
it.
sometimes the entrepreneur will create the process for the business, which may be a little bit different than the tactical plan in terms of how to approach something. My opinion, Rich, is efficiency, waste, and afraid of wasting time, energy, and money because the entrepreneur already knows how to get from point A to point B. But is it best for the entrepreneur to say, here's how you guys should do it, here is the plan? Or is it best to let them go through that process, guide them a little bit, but be okay with them making mistakes? Be okay with them maybe not being as efficient as you would be so they can learn in their own debriefs if you have that culture. And I find that it's very hard as an entrepreneur to see dollars going away because you're not efficient, because you know there's a better way to do it. You want to tell them how to fix it, but you can't hold yourself back, so you go fix it for them, or you do
lack
it for
of efficiency costs the entrepreneur money. and they're watching dollar bills fly out the door. If you just look at a typical sales and production oriented business, leads come in. There's a certain way the entrepreneur figured out on how to process those leads and maximize profit from the leads of whatever they're selling, a service or a product, right? So then they watch somebody else take the golden leads and then not execute what they know to be efficiency. They're seeing dollar bills fly out the window. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. So how would you recommend, though, an entrepreneur handle that? Because the best way is to, again, let whoever's executing the plan create the plan. But there's waste potentially involved in that versus the entrepreneur saying, I'm going to show you all what to do. I've done this for 10 years. Here's how you do it. Here's how you take care of the golden leads. And they're more efficient maybe in that moment, but they create a different culture.
Yeah. In our business, we have an equation that we use that's E times B equals R. The E is the effectiveness of the solution times B, which is the buy-in of the learner, equals R, which is your result as a leader. So let me give you an example on how this works. If I have an effective solution of, let's say, a 9, and I push that down on someone, I say, you have to do it this way. This is an effective solution of a 9. And it really is. That learner, their buy-in level, let's say, might be a 2 because they didn't have any input to it and they're just trying to check the boxes, right? So 9 times 2 equals 18. Now, the hardest thing to do as a leader is exchange a lower quality solution for a higher buy-in, but watch what happens. If I ask the learner, and they have to have a certain amount of skill and experience and commitment to do this. You don't do this off of day one. But if you ask the learner, hey, how would you go about doing that? And they give you an effective solution, let's say of a 6. You're not going to accept the 2 or 3, right? Like that's not okay. But if they give you an effective solution of a 6 and their hair is on fire, like they love it, they love their idea, but you know it's only a 6. Their hair's on fire, they're an 8 on buy-in. 6 times 8, 48. So how did you get to a 48 result when it's not as good of an effective solution? It's because you exchanged a lower effectiveness on a solution for a higher buy-in. You get a better result because the execution of a less effective solution is going to outplay and outrank poor execution of a more effective solution.
That's a fantastic formula, and I wish that we all looked at every single scenario like that. Because if you looked at the scenario like that buy-in would exponentially increase your result versus the effective solution,
yes,
I think that entrepreneurs would have more commander's intent and let their teams go figure it out. And you're right. An entrepreneur is not going to let their team come up with a too effective solution.
No.
They're going to jump in some way, shape, or form, whisper in someone's ear, and make sure that the effective solution is at least up where it needs to be, or else their business will be lost.
Yes.
But the power of buy-in with your team is very critical. And I think that entrepreneurs sometimes don't realize that if they act more like a commander with commander's intent and really bring their team into the execution of the plan, they can maybe spend time working on their business instead of in their business, in the weeds of the tactical plans, which I love, and I thought that was a great way to express it from Brandon's perspective, because the commanders don't have to be in the debrief room. They don't have to be in the fields with the troops, right? They can say, here's our intent. You guys go take care of it. And their effective solution, the buy-in on those troops is a 10.
Well, yes, and keep in mind the job of the leader is not to solve the problem that their people have. That's not the job of the leader.
Easier said than done.
Well, the job of the leader is to equip their learner to solve the problem. I just had a conversation with somebody in our business about this exactly. I won't go through the exact scenario, but we were talking about, that's actually their problem. That's not your problem. Your job is to help them solve their problem. And again, that continues to push creating independent learners who have high buy-in to what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's great to have somebody that has lived the service side.
Yes.
Obviously has now moved into the management consulting, now has his own practice and does speaking with companies, because certainly there's a lot of relatable components from the time of service and maybe some of the misperceptions that people have about the ranks and the rigidness of military
Yes.
that I think he exposed here very well. So I really love the conversation.
I did as well.